Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025. I'm John Podhortz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
We have two big topics today. We have to discuss the remarkable funeral of Charlie Kirk, and we need to discuss the UN General Assemblies and then the various Western countries' decision to recognize a Palestinian state that has no borders, no capital, no government, no governance, no form, no leader. It's like recognizing Laputa in Gulliver's Travels, which is a non-existent company that it's flying in the air. But it's an important moment nonetheless. But maybe we should start with Charlie Kirk's funeral. I will confess that I was driving all yesterday afternoon and was unable to watch any of it. I read a little bit about it, but Abe, you were there, not in Arizona, but you were there
in front of my TV. Yeah.
Yes. So
I was there for pretty much the entirety of it. I missed the opening prayer before the speaker started coming on, but I was there once, like Stephen Miller and Susie Wiles kicked things off. So I have a few takeaways because it's a lot to encapsulate. It was hours and hours and hours. Overwhelmingly, this Christian revival. They said as much. Speaker after speaker described it as that. Didn't feel terribly much like a memorial service for an individual in that sense, with exceptions that I'll get to. But there was a lot of, it's hard to even remember who said what, but I think it was J.D. Vance who said, "We are all now in Charlie's church," and I also think it was Vance that said he spoke about Jesus, that he himself, Vance, has spoken about Jesus more since Charlie died than he has in the entirety of his public life before. And it was Stephen Miller made reference to how Charlie's cause will be stronger than ever now, and we need more God and more people to come to Jesus, and there will be much more of this, particularly among young men, in the wake of Charlie's death. The exceptions to me were, because there was many hours of that, Tucker Carlson, of course, got out there, and he spoke about how Charlie's death reminds him of how the powerful people in Jerusalem thousands of years ago schemed in a dark candlelit room while eating hummus and decided that they had to kill Jesus because he was challenging them in power. And then he gave off his sinister cackle. So this was his blatant. He took his shot. He had his moment, and he used it to not so subtly implicate the Jews in Jesus' and Charlie's death. I have to say, I think he's so out there on a limb. I mean, emotionally, in his presentation, that I don't know how he finds purchase with this. It was a real dissonant note, to be honest, amid everything else. That was one exception. Another exception to the proceedings was Erica Kirk's remarkable. She actually, when she spoke, it felt for the first time to me like a memorial service of a human being. She spoke about him, about their love, about their marriage, what kept it strong. They wrote each other love notes. And then she, of course, had this incredible moment where She invoked Jesus and said, Charlie was trying to save the lost boys of America, including like the young man who shot him. And she said, "I forgive him." She forgives the alleged shooter of her husband. That was as powerful as anything you could ever see yesterday or on any other day. That was really remarkable. And then Trump, Donald Trump came up and weirdly almost undid some of that in saying, Erica's amazing. She loves her enemies. Not me. I hate my opponents. Maybe she could teach me and others how to love our opponents, but I hate our opponents. And he went into a very long, several sort of political tributaries. I think the one that got the most attention was his announcing that today the Trump administration will be making some revelations about autism, about its causes and its treatments. He talked about how Charlie, one of the last things he had said to him was, "Sir, you've got to clean up Chicago, and we're going to do that." And he made that quite political. He sort of ended the whole thing on this big MAGA note. Somewhere in there, Don Jr., before that, made a kind of offer to non-MAGA America, which I thought was a little interesting, saying, if you're not with us, but if you're sick of crime, if you're sick of open borders, if you're, we welcome you, there's room or whatever, join us. The overall impression was that this was one big religious revival, one big giant Christian revival.
It's an interesting thing for you to call it a revival, because in the late 1940s, the real birth, I would say, of mass American evangelicalism came with the revival meetings, which had been a feature of American life for 100 years before that, but with these mass revival meetings led by Billy Graham, who toured the country and basically said, "Come and accept Christ into your heart and you will be saved." And he became, for many decades, he was the most respected and popular figure in the United States among people outside of the megalopolis bubble, outside of the Washington to Boston bubble. I mean, the size of his fame, the courtship of him by presidents, all of that. And until the 1980s, when everything became political, he was a resolutely non-political figure, Billy Graham. And his purpose was to save to bring souls to Jesus in this personal relationship with God. There's been weirdly very little of this on a mass scale since that time. I mean, I think evangelicalism became a mass movement in the United States, and I think more people, aside from Catholicism, more people sort of I think define themselves as evangelical than any other kind of faith in the United States. But this would have been a familiar sight to Americans in a previous era, having a mass meeting where there were 10,000. This was 60, 70, 80,000 people, but tens of thousands of people would come to these tents that Billy Graham, put up outside major cities and do this scene. So it's in some sense it's a return to what made evangelicalism. Is that the right word? Because you wouldn't say evangelism, right? Or, I mean,
evangelicalism. Yes,
evangelicalism. What made it a potent force in American life, as in the post-war era, as Americans were urbanizing, leaving the farm, having these more sort of mass living in cities, living in suburbs, and losing their connection to the churches that they grew up in small towns and stuff like that, and finding this new form of being able to achieve your faith in a more personal way.
But Billy Graham, in a way, you could see him as an exception to the rule of how revivals went. And I actually thought the Charlie Kirk Memorial was more like Billy Sunday, more performance, more kind of wide range of non-theological, obviously quasi-political in the case of Trump, but more performative spectacle, which I think we do have the tent revivals. You think of Amy Semple McPherson and all these people in American history who actually were performative about bringing people to faith, but actually also had a sort of very large tent idea of what that could look like. Anyone could come in, anyone could dedicate themselves to Christ. And so I felt like there was a lot of that. I agree with Abe that it really did have that revival tone, but also had a lot of performance. I will say that Tucker, I agree with you about Tucker Abe, and I hope you're correct in diagnosing him as being an outlier. It reminded me, I mean, he's coming across now like some bastard child of, Father Coughlin and a would-be Instagram
And screw
influencer.
tape.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
he's just so, it's horrible. And this hummus whistle, I guess that's the new dog whistle. It's I won't say Jews, but you all know, wink, wink, what I'm talking about. I do hope that's an outlier. Erica Kirk's remarks should be spread far and wide. The dignity and courage with which she delivered them, the fact that this whole memorial was all put together. Now she's the head of this organization that her husband founded. And her message of no revenge, but love, forgiveness and love, and no hate. I think Tulsi Gabbard also gave a good defense of free speech in her remarks. I heard a little bit of those. So there were some really powerful themes, and Trump himself talking about defending Christians and what Charlie did to defend Christians and Jews on college campuses. So there were some really powerful strands there. It will be interesting to see how those are processed by people who aren't of that world or have disdain for that world.
I don't you think the headline will be Erica Kirk, though? I mean,
I hope so. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was just an incredible piece of oratory that she delivered yesterday. I can't quite wrap my head around the enormity of the proceedings. It was extremely large. They filled the NFL stadium. There was an overflow crowd of many, many people.
Turning Point USA says 90,000 people
Right.
attended between the crowd in the stadium and the crowd outside the stadium.
Right. And so, and just in historical perspective, it is akin to like a president dying or, a state funeral type gathering. I think that the largest public memorial was in American history or modern American history was Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral that had several 100,000 people. But this is approaching that, right, for a 31-year-old who was clearly touching millions of people in a way that was invisible to much of intellectual America and the college elite. So there's the scale just in sheer numbers. Then there's the scale of the speakers, which is to say, you had half the Trump administration there. So it's clear this whole kind of political dimension to it. He wasn't part of the administration, but he clearly was a central figure in the MAGA universe and in, I think, advising the administration from the outside. And then finally, you had this religious cultural dimension, which is super political. It's even larger than the politics of it. And that's why I think Erica Kirk was so amazing. It's just the first time I've ever seen a speaker upstage Donald Trump. Think about that. And I think the key is she is just as authentic as Trump. But the authenticity is doing something different than Trump. And that contrast that Abe mentioned between love your enemies, hate your enemies was fascinating because they're both being completely honest. She is being completely honest to herself, to her understanding of the Christian faith when she said those remarkable words. And then when Trump follows her and says, well, Charlie said, love your enemies. I hate my enemies. And he did it with the half smile, as he always does. That's also how we completely understand that that's who Trump is. And so this kind of currency of authenticity, I think, is the biggest thing you can have in American culture and society today. And I think that's why Erica Kirk will be far more influential than Tucker.
I think, by the way, what's interesting about the dynamic between what Trump said and what Erica Kirk said, and you're saying that she upstaged him, was that he bowed to her.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about what he said, Erica says we should love our enemies. I hate my opponents. Maybe she can teach us something about how to behave better. When has Trump ever spoken words anything remotely like that? Like, he was basically saying, you're a better person than I am, and I might have something to learn from you. I'm sorry, he said. He said, I hate my opponents. I'm sorry, but I do. And that's the words I'm sorry do not come out of his mouth for a very deliberate reason. And so you have these two faces, right, of how to deal with this cultural moment, which is, I hate my opponents. I want to destroy them. They want to destroy me. I want to destroy them. Erica Kirk says, Charlie wanted to save young men. One way to save this young man is to provide him love and forgiveness. I forgive him. What that reminds me of is the Pope with Mehmet Ali Agca, who was his assassin. The Pope went to a prison in Italy and sat with Agca.
Pope John Paul II.
Pope John Paul II in 1982. He was shot in 1981, and Agca was convicted, and he went to visit him in prison and hold his hand and pray with him. And Agca sobbed and wept and asked for the Pope's forgiveness for his actions. And that, more than anything else, I believe historically brought what we've been calling the assassination era to an end. That scene of the Pope forgiving the man who shot and nearly killed him did something to the emotional ether that ended this period of nearly 20 years in which there was a kind of ongoing effort across the globe to kill leaders, assassinate leaders for political reasons. I don't imagine that this is a comparable circumstance, but it is very hauntingly similar. And I, for one, speaking from my own faith tradition, I'm not closer to Trump, because Trump is talking about making this a political matter. Jews on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and the days of awe in which we reflect on our actions and sins, we do not respond to murder as Erica Kirk did, or as we say, may God avenge their blood. That is the prayer that you say to, for someone who has been murdered. You say different, or you say something else to a family that has had a person die. You say, may you be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. But we say, may God avenge their blood. It is considered just to punish the perpetrator. Now, you can still punish Tyler Robinson, find him guilty in a court. By the way, you could even give him the death penalty, punished. Forgiveness is in the heart. And I suppose any human being can find that power within them. It's a very rare phenomenon for anybody I've ever known who's had a family member murdered. That murder is an ongoing wound that never goes away and never heals in a way that a natural death, or even an accidental death, can heal. What she means by it, how she proceeds with her life, I hope that she hasn't overburdened herself in a weird way with this power that she asserted yesterday, this kind of moral power, because she is 36 years old. She does have 2 small children, and this absolutely horrendous thing has been done to her. And I mean, not to be patronizing, but she kind of needs to process it or cope with it or find a way to live through it. And obviously this 2 weeks of unprecedented public, private, national mourning, anger, fights, all this means that she probably hasn't had an opportunity or a chance to do that. She's just living in a whirlwind.
Right. I mean, don't you think, though? I mean, she's clearly stepped up to the moment. I think she's met the moment. I mean, if you think about her three main communications.
I mean, in her soul. I'm not really. I mean, maybe that's why I say maybe it sounds patronizing, and I shouldn't. You know, I don't know her, and I don't know anything about her life or anything like that. But sometimes people assume these mantles, and then they're very heavy. The burden is very heavy because it's also a way of not quite pushing the thing you need to resolve. Not that it's resolvable to one side. That's all I'm referring to. I don't.
Right. Well, I would just say
more than met the moment. I mean, she's now become a major national figure in 10 days' time or however long it's been.
You know, that's right. And I was going to say that. And there's three main communications she's given since the assassination. There was the message she gave next to his chair on the show. There was an interview, a lengthy interview with Robert Draper in the New York Times yesterday. And then there was the eulogy or / remarks at the memorial service yesterday afternoon. And all three of them have been really remarkable. So just considering this whirlwind that she's been sucked into, I think that she's more than meeting the challenge. And I understand that you're saying something about the personal, the inner side. I just want to make one more point about Trump and Erica Kirk. My wife informed me recently that Erica Kirk was on a reality show, and Donald Trump is the reality TV master. And so I just am mulling over this paradox that the most authentic speakers yesterday and at large come from the most factitious medium. What is it? It's something about that reality TV somehow it teaches or informs authenticity, which then clearly is some people are able to communicate through television much better than others.
That is a very interesting observation. It's like, you know, Survivor, which was really the show that gave birth to reality TV. The moment that fixed reality TV forever was this moment at the end of the first season of Survivor when the tribe voted against this woman whose last name was Hawk and in favor of this guy who then ended up going to prison for tax evasion and tax fraud. And she delivered this weird speech out of nowhere about snakes and who's a snake and who's trustworthy and who's not trustworthy. That was one of the most jaw-dropping moments ever in the history of television because it broke through that weird inauthenticity. It broke, even though Survivor was here, you saw them doing all this stuff in the woods and everything, but as this guy who won said, it's a game. It's a game, and we're all playing the game, and I figured out how to play the game and win. And she's like, no, human beings aren't supposed to behave this way toward one another. This is not how society works. You're not allowed to say one thing to my face and then go behind my back and say something else. So there may be the contrast between the factitiousness and these moments of candor or true that elevates and heightens the truth, that it emerges from this cesspool of falsity.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's culturally,
struck me.
Yeah. I want to talk about Tucker Carlson for a minute because I didn't watch the whole speech, but of course I saw the minute of the, you know, it reminds me of this time 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. And when he finished, when he said, and these people sitting around eating hummus, and they're like, let's kill him. Let's kill him. And he famously has this, you know, cackle, right? Like on the show where you see him sort of laugh. That was like a horror movie moment. That was like a jump scare, his laugh. That wasn't sort of like, it was, first of all, glaringly inappropriate.
Right.
He's in the middle of delivering a memorial to somebody else. And it didn't sound...
Then assassinated. So like joking about,
And it didn't sound like the like Tucker cackle. I mean, I say this like there was something demonic in it, and in that sense, I agree with. I hope you're right, Abe, that this is not, he's not the future, and that Erica Kirk or some version of the more pacific way of going forward is the future. But I think there was some weird revelation of the deep darkness and evil, and I say that unqualifiedly, evil inside Tucker's soul, that this sound emerged naturally from his body as he was delivering this, as though Vatican II never happened condemnation. You know what this reminds me of is that the Jews killed Christ.
In a slightly...
Which Catholics, of course, are no longer, not that he's a Catholic, but I mean, the Catholics are no longer theologically supposed to accept that, Jews killed Christ, Jews killed Charlie Kirk. And the other weird part about this is this effort to connect Jews to this assassination is really... Tyler Robinson was raised Mormon. He's a furry with a transgender boyfriend who says he just wanted to end the hate. Where are the Jews in any of this?
Well, and it should also be added that you mentioned Catholics, but in evangelical culture, the Jews killed Jesus stuff is really not present. That is an anti-Semitic trope that exists, unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle. But it is not. I mean, Vatican II did actually remove that sort of quasi-endorsement of the idea, from Catholics. But even evangelicals tend to be philo-Semitic, like they're the opposite of that. And so he's not even expressing a view that was in keeping with the people gathered at that ceremony.
But that there's a war raging within evangelicalism over Israel, and the status of the Hebrew Bible within the Christian faith. And Tucker has planted his flag with the view that the new covenant, Jesus's covenant, superseded all the covenants that God made with the Jews, and that's happening, and he knows it, and so this assassination has been pulled into that fight. That's what's happening within American evangelicalism, and then the fight more broadly over Israel and the Hamas war, but that it's done so strategically and so quickly, it clearly, again, points to foreign operators who are, manipulating the algorithm in order to plant these seeds of conspiracy and then watch them flower online. And that's the petri dish where Tucker Carlson and his podcast cronies reside.
I think it's also important to point out that Tucker Carlson is not an evangelical Christian. He's an Episcopalian. He grew up an Episcopalian. He went to an Episcopalian school. He is married to the daughter of an Episcopalian minister who was the headmaster of the school that he attended. I haven't spoken to him about this in decades, but as people may or may not know, I was Tucker's editor for 2 years. I was one of the people who hired him at the Weekly Standard and began his career, assigned him many of the articles that helped make him famous in the world of opinion writing. And he had views that were very interestingly heterodox at the time for a very, he was very conservative in many ways, very libertarian in others. He had written a book for the Heritage Foundation on policing that he then refused to publish or gave back the money that they had paid him because he had decided when he was done with it that he was morally opposed to the argument that his own book made about how the need for tough policing, because that was too empowering to authorities, pro-life, very pro-life. But he was in all other respects a conventional Episcopalian. The stuff that he is now peddling and has been peddling now for a couple of years, is some kind of weird, sick stew of Pentecostalist ideas about, demonic possessions, and there's parapsychology, and there's, and all this, and then this direct anti-Semitism, which he will even bring in the idea that Charlie Kirk is Jesus, or Charlie Kirk is the modern Jesus, and therefore he was probably killed by the same people who killed Jesus. Which would be fine with me, because the Romans killed Jesus. But, if he wants to blame the ancient Romans, if he wants to blame Etruscans for killing Jesus, I don't even know if there are any of them who are still around. Good luck to you. But of course, that's not what he's about. This is a political program. And as I say, I think that the laugh at the end, if you were watching thinking, where do I go in this conversation? That would have been at least a way of saying, I don't like that guy. Like, what the hell was that noise that came out of his mouth? I thought it was very revealing, not only that he couldn't control himself, but that almost like a reverse of the story of Balaam's ass in the Bible, the priest who, the Gentile prophet who is sent out to curse the Jews and ends up praising them because God fills his mouth. It's almost as though the devil filled Tucker Carlson's mouth, or God filled Tucker Carlson's mouth with a demonic noise to let you know that what he had just said was not to be heeded. I
think that's well put.
Maybe I'm being sentimental here, but
no,
I don't know.
It was totally jarring, and I think in only a slightly better world would have been a career ender, given the context. You had people in the audience weeping, broad swaths of them, at various points, and then suddenly he's up there like the Joker, making this crazy accusation. It was like he was injected into this, and where was the hook to get him off?
Hummus, by the way, is not a Jewish food. I just would like to say it's not even an Israeli food exactly. Like, hummus is one of the dishes that Jews began to eat in the Middle East because they moved, with the various, immigrations into the Holy Land. They began to eat because it was like a native thing that they could learn how to make easily out of chickpeas. There are almost 400,000 Arabs who live in Jerusalem proper. They eat a lot of hummus. Maybe he was talking about how the Arabs killed
the Middle Eastern Jews who migrated to Israel after all the Arab governments expelled them.
Right. But I mean, as I say, there are 400,000 Arabs who live in Jerusalem. So when he said there was a bunch of, they're eating hummus there at the, in the, I don't know what this meeting was. Was it supposed to be the Sanhedrin or something, and then they decide to kill him. And they're eating hummus. Well, that could have been Arabs, I suppose. I mean, the fact that he found this image in his head of the hummus eater, I guess, is better than saying they were sitting around, with their yarmulkes on, praying over a Hebrew book and then saying we should kill him. But it was pretty close, and I wouldn't make too much of this, except that for the fight that Matt's talking. So Matt's talking about a fight within evangelical Christianity over the place of the of the Old Testament, and the superseding question of the New Testament. Tucker emerges out of a right-wing world that is not all that faith-driven. I mean, if he's the woke right or the dark web, whatever you want, those people are very secular. The ones where that a lot of this kind of modern anti-Semitism are emerging about how Israel is dragging America into the Jews are dragging America into the world, into conflicts they should not be involved in, and all of that. Like these guys, Curtis Yarvin and Daryl Cooper and all that, they're not religious people. They're kind of anti-religious people.
But like Candace Owens that's the whole Christ is King signaling that she does.
Right.
But that's actually perhaps the reason why they've embraced so zealously the anti-Semitism. It is a replacement faith for them at this point. It is what they pursue with the kind of zeal and unhinged clarity and oversimplification. I think that's the story he was trying to pass along and signal to people like him,
Right.
who were listening. It's, of course, it's a conspiracy where people got around and said, this guy's too powerful, we'll kill him. And they did the same thing to Charlie. So that is his world now. He is completely sunk in this secular faith of conspiracy theory and anti-Semitism.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Matt, is I think what's interesting about this moment and how unprecedented it seems, and the fact that 90,000 people show up in Arizona to go to this funeral and millions are affected, and I keep hearing anecdotal stories from people who I friends who have kids on large college campuses, that this is a very big deal at Michigan, at Ohio State, in ways that you would not expect. There are going to be ways to measure whether this has a real world effect, or whether it's a sort of another moment in the world of which issues or big things flare up and seem to blot out the sun, and then 6 months later you don't remember that they even happened, which is, will there be a lot of registrations of Republican voters among the young over the next year? Will church attendance increase in certain types of play? These are things that we're going to be able to see and measure. And, I think people should sort of hold their, they should be cautious about assuming that this is a revolutionary moment. But it could.
Well, my thought is that it's like you begin to see some of the submerged part of the iceberg. And, there's some hints that have been going on that we're in the beginnings of a religious revival. The Pew Survey Center found that the decline in religious belief has plateaued in recent years. The Catholic Church in America noticed a huge spike in conversions among young people. And that's, I think, at the church broadly, too, globally. There's, of course, in Judaism, much smaller population, but there's also a turn toward much more traditional Judaism. Intellectually, you have a whole spate of books now making rationalist cases for religious belief, whether that's Ross Douthat's book Believe. Charles Murray has a book coming out in October on taking religion seriously. Jonathan Rauch is more of a liberal, but he makes a case in a recent book, too, that religion is essential for liberal democracy. I happen to agree with him. And then you have this moment. And you have again, it's political, but this is not about voter registration when I look at it. I think there's something much deeper going on, and it's reflected in Erica Kirk's remarks. And so I think one of the tests will be what does the Turning Point revival look like? Does she are they going to try to fill up another NFL stadium somewhere else in the country and get young people to pronounce their Christian faith, which is what happened earlier in the day? There was a moment, an altar call that was delivered by Charlie Kirk's minister who was there. I think that will be what I'm looking for. The political aspect, it just seems to me is small compared with the religious cultural dimension here, which is clearly there's a vacuum. There's been a vacuum for at least 10 years, probably longer, among young people in particular. Lack of meaning, lack of purpose, no connection to the fundamental social institutions of family and religion. And we're beginning to see it addressed. And I think that the Kirk assassination was something of a catalyst for that.
This gets a slightly on an adjacent topic. I don't want to spend too long on it, but it's so interesting that this moment has come about at all. I'm talking about this sort of plateauing of the nuns, of the NONE, the non-believers in anything, and the this hunger for faith or something to believe in among the young. Part of what happened also here is that there was this generation of extraordinarily successful atheist influencers, and they're gone. They're either just sort of faded from the scene. Some have died, like Christopher Hitchens, and they were replaced by believing influencers. And
or they switched to consider Ayaan Hirsi, right?
Yeah.
And now Richard Dawkins, of all people, is calling himself a cultural Christian in response to what's happening in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
So yes,
and then
the new atheists are no more.
And I have to say, you have Jordan Peterson. You could think whatever you want of him, who sort of like became this massive signal.
Was the leading
figure.
edge.
Leading edge in telling wayward Western young males, like, consider God, consider religion, and by the way, don't blame the Jews.
Well, in the addition, and alongside that, perhaps, I hope, an exhaustion among that young population with what was their replacement faith for the past 10 years, which was politics, woke politics in particular. I think the unhappiness levels we see among the young are a reflection of the fact that they do have a sense of purposelessness and, meaning in their lives, and that the idea, which was sold, I would say, by some of our politicians, that politics was an appropriate replacement for that search for meaning, has proven to them, in their own experience, to be not true.
There are two things I want to bring up, and then we can move on. One is that the epistemic bubble problem of the left and the right. We're saying, the atheists are gone and all of that. The decline of faith has plateaued. The epistemic bubble of the world of people for whom religion plays no role is still there and still real. And it has many generations of roots. I mean, for example, the most famous news magazine cover in American history, which came out, I think, in 1965, was Time's Is God Dead? Right? Time magazine put this "Is God Dead" on the cover. It was like a huge news story. I don't know that there's ever been anything quite like it, but it was, are people moving away from religion? Has science disproven the miraculous and all of that? And it emerged just at the moment at which American society, which had been being managed on very rationalist principles, pretty much from Woodrow Wilson on through the New Deal and through the sort of managerial Johnson administration, Robert McNamara, all this stuff that seemed to be drained of moral meaning. At this moment of God is dead was also the moment at which Martin Luther King was bringing his message to the world, where this revivalism that we began the podcast with, Billy Graham's revivalism, was starting to sink real roots into the United States and into the less urban places in the United States, giving birth to 100 different kind of religious leaders in the world of evangelicalism who would start forming this informal network of people who started to dip their toe into politics to save because politics was dipping its toe into morality, like legalizing abortion, thus raising this eternal question of what is life and who is responsible for life, where does life come from, and all of that. Like an amazingly ill-timed moment for this conversation, because like 14 years later, the moral majority would play a key role in helping elect Ronald Reagan. And now I think this war will be even uglier, because the nuns are full of their own virtue and believe that the faithful are evil. Not that they're being thrown into the dustbin of history, which was the idea of the nuns of a previous era. It's just like, well, this is all very backward and it's all going to go away. I mean, my grandmother believed this stuff, but I don't believe this stuff anymore. And they're fighting back. That's why Tyler Robinson shot Charlie Kirk in the head. I mean, this is a real thing that could get very, very ugly. I mean, it's already gotten ugly. I don't mean that it hasn't gotten ugly. I just mean that, if America does actually go through like a fourth religious awakening, that is not going to happen easily. Like, there is going to be real resistance.
Yeah, well, nothing's happening easily these days.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of this kind of historical moment we're in that, can rightly be called revolutionary. And it's sometimes hard to figure out, are we in a counter-revolution right now with the Trump countering the revolution that took place over the last 10 years with the Great Awakening, or are we in the beginning of the revolution? And we have all this terminological confusion, because 5 years ago all the statues were taken down, all the names were changed to be woke, and now statues are going back up. Robert E. Lee is going back up at West Point, but we're also changing names: Gulf of America, Department of War, Mount McKinley. So which is it? So it's a moment. It's just a complete maelstrom, and that's why I think that it's the deeper causes are these religious and spiritual ones,
right?
That is kind of behind the political activity of both the woke and the awake.
So to move on to the UN meeting this week, and on the eve of the UN meeting this week, the UN General Assembly voting to recognize a Palestinian state, which it's kind of done before, by the way. And in the 1980s or something like that, there was some kind of weird procedural vote, I guess, that allowed the Palestinians to exist as a voting member, a member of the UN General Assembly. But hundreds of nations voting to recognize a Palestinian state, 12 nations, including the United States, voting against it. Interestingly enough, as a friend of mine pointed out yesterday, 3 nations that voted against recognition of a Palestinian state were the Axis nations of World War II. Japan, Germany, and Italy voted against the recognition of a Palestinian state. It's just an interesting, weird detail, because the Allies, of course, Britain, France, Canada, are now participants in the creation of a Palestinian state. I'm struck by the fact that I'm not panicked by this, or consider it terrifying, or like that this is some kind of like development that, is like the Zionism is racism resolution 50 years ago, that one needs a Pat Moynihan to stand up and, scream no and thunder and like harness the moral objections of the world. It just seems like more nonsense and ugliness, and I really wish it weren't happening, but it doesn't seem to really have any real world. I'm not sure what the conceivable real world consequences will be from it. Maybe it's even a way of letting off steam such that they voted for it and now they don't have to, do an economic boycott because of the evil of Israel and Gaza or something. It's that we voted for the Palestinian state, so we can end there. We've made our little gesture. We've given you your Oscar for best documentary, and now you can leave us alone. But maybe I'm whistling past the graveyard, and this is the worst thing that's ever happened.
Well, I think one thing you're responding to is just the weakness of the states that made news in recognizing the state of Palestine. So, the United Kingdom, France, and Canada, they're not what they once were. They don't have power. It's a gesture, and no one takes seriously that there will be a Palestinian state ever, as Elliot Abrams, I thought, put it so well in an essay for Mosaic this month. That's the first thing. The second thing I noticed, and Amit Segal reported on this yesterday, is that this is an unpopular decision in the countries that are recognizing the state of Palestine. And I think actually another example of that type of epistemic closure you're talking about in a different context just a moment ago, that the kind of laptop class elites throughout the West in these kind of impoverished countries. They've just England in particular and Canada have really sacrificed their economies on the altar of the Green New Deal. They're no longer serious military powers to the extent that they once were. They don't have much diplomatic clout any longer. They're always appealing to the United States to do more. And they think that this is the most pressing moral demand of the time, whereas the populations in these countries have moral clarity and common sense, unlike their leadership. And so Canadian politics, until Trump started talking about the 51st state, those conservatives were on their way to trouncing the liberals. British politics, we've talked before about how the weird nature of the British electoral system meant that Starmer has this huge majority. He's incredibly unpopular. And in fact, Nigel Farage, the British Trump, is just ascending with each passing day. And then look at France. I think, being the French prime minister these days is like being the drummer in Spinal Tap. You have a very short life. I think Macron is on his fourth or fifth. Someone was just
Macron is the president. We should Macron is the president,
and then head of prime minister, the National Assembly,
head of government. Yeah,
right. And that place is ready for a crack up as well. So I think the same one, they're weak, and so it doesn't matter. And two, they're both weak within their polities, and it's actually reassuring to see that the publics in these nations aren't with the leadership on the question of the Palestinian state.
One last point to bring up here: Trump is a believer in the grand wild gesture, and I think if this goes on much longer, there might be something where in the last 2 years of his administration or something, he announces that the U.S. should pull out of the UN. Something that has been a talking point in some circles for half a century. Just as he decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem, it all depends on. But I mean, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said yesterday that or the other day that the situation in Gaza, the war in Gaza, is the worst loss of life and the worst war that he's seen in his tenure at the UN. And there is a war going on right now, South Sudan, where is it 450,000 people have been killed. It was there when the Syrian civil war was going on.
War in Ukraine.
Right. War in Ukraine, which is like 1 million people have died. This nonsense is coming out of his mouth, and it's delegitimizing. If the UN, if UNRWA is basically an arm of Hamas, if the UN Human Rights Council is an arm of anti-Semitism and all of that, the United States doesn't have to participate in this. The United States doesn't have to house the UN. The UN does a lot of things that we offload onto it so that we don't have to bother with it. But Trump doesn't believe that we should be doing any of that, a lot of that stuff anyway. And I would watch this space. I'm not saying I've heard anything from anybody about it, but he doesn't care.
Well, they've denied visas for some of the people who've wanted to come to this week's meeting, which I think is which is a step in the direction you're describing, and a good thing, like preventing those folks from actually coming to the United States. Nothing wrong with that.
Anyway, I'm just saying, like, if he's going to invent Space Force and he's going to, seize Greenland and stuff like that, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he
Now's
can say,
the time.
27 acres at the UN that we could really have if you can develop Mara Gaza, you could develop Mara UN.
Riverfront property.
Right there on the,
now might be the time to go get your US out of UN bumper sticker from the Birchers on eBay. That was extremely popular in the 60s to have on the back of your car.
And of course, you have to add UN out of the US. That's what's important, because that's what will appeal to Trump is, like there's a development site just sitting right there. Whole building, crappy mid-century building, get rid of it, put up some nice gold and glass tower.
Once this TikTok deal is settled, once he can move on to the next deal,
which once again he's punted on unconstitutionally, defying what Congress has passed in the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, it is my hobby horse. Whatever this deal is, also China is saying nothing about agreeing to what he is claiming in Western media. There's no deal. There's no deal yet.
We don't even know what the deal is. Like, the last thing I heard is that like Larry Ellison of Oracle is gonna, take over the algorithm. But like, you can only take over the algorithm if they give you the formula to the algorithm.
No, it's the information that would still flow to the CCP. That's why the legislation passed by Congress was very clear. It had to be a divestment from ByteDance.
I think it's kind of like that terrible movie. It's a mad world where everyone just starts chasing I forget even what the MacGuffin is in that movie, but
it's like a suitcase full of money.
Right. So more and more people start chasing the suitcase over time. And, because the list of potential business partners in this deal just grows with each passing day. Yeah. And of course, the government would have a board seat, which is part of the Trump economic strategy at every company he acquires. And yet we're not really any closer to getting that suitcase, are we?
It is outrageous. It's just outrageous. And make one more point in the morosity thing before I go to is this shooting at this country club in New Hampshire on Saturday night, which was invaded by a guy who started yelling "Free Palestine" and shooting. And what was interesting about this, first of all, the fact that now it not even doesn't have to be like a target of any particular meaning. If you want to express Free Palestine, you go into a country club and shoot there, as opposed to shooting Charlie Kirk or even doing, that basically now any event, anything where there are people standing could be a moment for a mass killing, is a pretty frightening development. And even more frightening was the response of the sheriff of the county in New Hampshire, who said, well, I think he was just yelling random things to cause chaos.
Yes. And so if you'll note, the accounts now in the press, they've started dropping it. They've started leaving out the Free Palestine call. Because the sheriff said this, right? So now they're making it seem as if, this is just a crazy ex-employee with no political motivation here. Keep watching that. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of what happened the day after the Kirk assassination, when all the information came out about who Tyler Robinson was, and then it was like, this is all made up, and there's no one can prove that it was on the bullets, and he did someone just made up that his boyfriend was trans and all of that, and then all the news stories dropped it. The Wall Street Journal pulled the details from its revised its article that was correct to remove this incendiary information, and then of course Tuesday morning. Even after Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, had alluded to these details in a press conference, and then we waited till Tuesday morning when the prosecutor came out and basically read the text message chain and presented the evidence that had been found, and then it was like, okay, well, there's really not much we can.
But that effort continues in the media. There have been stories and people talking about how, the right wing is going to weaponize the fact that he was trans or his boyfriend was trans, and saying we shouldn't talk about the trans aspect because that's a threat to trans people. So I've seen threads of that.
Yeah, well, Lydia Polgreen said in a column in the New York Times that the suggestions of a trans connection to this are evil. So I went on Twitter and said, I'm not suggesting it, I'm stating it outright. There's a trans connection to this to this assassination. Prove me wrong, as Charlie Kirk would say. He said, I was sick of the hate, my love, to Lance Twiggs, his trans boyfriend. So, is there a connection? It's like, it's a connection the way, the way a Lego connects to another Lego. And then it's hard to pull them apart. So, that is pretty dark. Okay, I'm going to recommend a pretty dark but really remarkable book. A friend of mine, our listener, John M., said to me, I'm reading this writer from the 50s and 60s named Margaret Millar, and I'm obsessed with her, and I never heard of her. And then I bought this Library of America collection of suspense fiction, and one of her books, The Fiend, was one of the books in it, and it was amazing. And now I'm reading all her work. Turns out she was the wife of Ross MacDonald, who became a much more famous mystery writer, wrote the Harper Mysteries. Although early in their career, she was in the 50s, she was more successful than he. Had the name Millar, which was his real name, and he changed his name to Ross MacDonald so that he would not look like he was writing on his wife's best-selling coattails. So, as often happens, she has been sort of lost in the mists of history. The book that my friend John read is called The Fiend, and I read it over the last week, and it's a very small and unbelievably unnerving and powerful story about a 32-year-old guy in a small town in Northern California who has returned, who is working, in a sort of a steady job, living with his brother, having returned from a mental institution where, as we figure out, he was put after an accusation that he had molested in some fashion or other a small girl on a playground. And we meet him and his brother and this librarian who decides she's in love with him. And then these couples who have a couple that has a daughter's best friend is the daughter of a woman who is divorcing her husband and thinks her husband is going to kidnap her child. And in the course of this book, these marriages, these relationships, who this guy actually is, what he actually did, whether he is this monster, whether he is the fiend of the title, or whether somebody else in this book is the fiend of the title. It's one of the most powerful things I've read in a very long time. It's not supernatural. It's not even really a suspense book per se, but it gets you on every page. This kind of leafy American mid-century. There's a lot of darkness behind these bucolic looking houses in this lovely little town in Northern California. Once you go inside and go to the barbecue and go to the dinner party, there's a lot of action going on under the surface. It's really a remarkable book. I bought it on Kindle for $4. It's short, and it really packs a huge punch. So that's Margaret Millar's The Fiend. We will not be podcasting over the next 2 days as it is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So we'll be back on Thursday. To all who celebrate, Shana Tova Umetuka. Have a sweet and wonderful New Year, and we will be back during the period called Chol HaMoed. That's the in-between time between Rosh Hashanah and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which happens next week. So, for Christine, Matt, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.